Magnificat. We'll sing the song and then be dismissed to our classes. Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in my soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in
All right, we are in Numbers, unless you've been gone for a year. So we're in Numbers, turn to Numbers, we're in chapter 11, coming into chapter 12. We have new lesson material, so Dusty and Toby are going to be passing that out to catch us up from last week and get us into this week. So if you need lesson material, if you didn't happen to pick it up on the way in and would like it, feel free, and they will be happy to get that to you. And as they are doing that, we're going to try to refresh our minds about where we are in Numbers. We have kind of, as far as the way Numbers is divided, or maybe that's not the best word, organized, structured, we have come into an important section. We kind of crossed that section the last week or two, and will be vital kind of as we move through. You'll see what I'm talking about. But the first major section in Numbers is, of course, Numbers 1 and verse 1 through chapter 10 and about verse 10. And in that section, what are some principles that we found, or what do we see in the story of Numbers up to chapter 10 or so? Exactly. So one of the first things, and it's interesting because as you look at the book of Numbers, just the word Numbers can be pretty intimidating to some people. And then there's sections that make it feel like Leviticus, maybe. And unless you're an Old Testament buff or something, that can be a little intimidating. But when you look at Numbers overall, what is that title? What does that title really in Hebrews? Does anybody remember? In the wilderness, yeah. So, if it was named that, it might not be as intimidating, but so really we're talking about Israel journeying in the wilderness on the way to where? Yeah, Promised Land. Should be very familiar with that. New Testament talks quite a lot about that. 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews 3 and 4, a lot of shadowing going on of our Promised Land, which is heaven. So with that understanding, the first 10 chapters looks pretty good for Israel, actually. I mean, there's a few spots, but overall, you have Moses leading them. God gives his organization. And one very important thing, and we want to bring it to ourselves today, even in the New Testament church, but that organization, and some people go, oh, that's so meticulous. And it is. The organization is quite meticulous and detailed. But what does it represent about God? What'd you say, Julie? Holiness. What'd you say? Yes, so you have God's holiness. You even have God's love because he has a purpose for his people. The very fact that he's organizing things indicates who he is and his holiness, his love, because if he didn't love us, he wouldn't have a purpose for us and wouldn't have even had a purpose for Israel. But when you think of organization, and that's true of Old Testament, New Testament, God is a God of patterns, okay? And sometimes when we hear patterns, some people think, oh, I'm bored now, okay? But really think of pattern in the sense of plan, purpose, and the motivation behind purpose is that God wants a relationship with his people. And so really, pattern and relationship aren't two separate things, are they? They go together. The pattern is the means to God's purpose for the people he has a relationship with. And if we can understand that about the beginning of Numbers, that's helpful. So those are the big ideas in Numbers. How did Israel do with that, though? I mean, God gives his purpose, gives all this organization. We have the tribes. We have the tabernacle, of course, which is very important in biblical literature overall. You have the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God was. Who could go into the Holy of Holies? The high priest. How many times a year could he go in there? Only once. When he went in there, he offered sacrifice for his sins and the sins of the people. And of course, when you come to the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus went into the real Holy of Holies. He went into the heavenly presence of God. He had no sin to offer a sacrifice for. He was sinless. He is the perfect high priest. So you see all of those correlations and connections and all of that. But you have all this organization. What does he say Israel did with that organization, generally speaking? Yeah, it says over and over. It starts in, I think, chapter 1 and verse 54 of Numbers. It says they did just as God commanded them, which is, and I know we've emphasized this, but I think it needs to be emphasized. Does that mean they were sinless? No, because there was a sacrificial system that was going to be in place. There were offerings to be had. But it does say to us, because it does seem that there are some who have the notion that, it's impossible for us to fully obey God. Well, they were fully obeying God. And now, that doesn't mean we never make mistakes, but he says they did just as God commanded them. And this is mentioned over and over and over. Now, when you're reading a book of the Bible and you see a statement that's made over and over and over and over, you just know That's a theme, okay? That's a theme he's drawing out. So he's saying in this first part of Numbers, they did just as God had commanded. Had they moved yet? No. So it takes us all the way back to Exodus 19, when you have of course, you have the giving the commandments and the covenant with God and all of that. They're getting ready to be moving, all right, and really go on this journey. Well, eventually they start moving. Did God have plans for how they were to move? Yeah. Everybody had a responsibility. Everybody had a job. Did everybody have the same job? No. But if you did your job and the tribe next to you did their job, then God's purpose would be accomplished, okay? All right, so with that in mind, we got on into Numbers 10, and some things start happening in this shift. So you have, how many generations do you have in Numbers? Just two, okay. So the first generation starts out really well, and had they continued on that path, would it have been very long for them to be in the promised land? No. They were just about there. If you look on the map where they were, they end up going in circles because of what's about to happen, what we've begun to see, which is their rebellion and sinfulness and all that. So the first major kind of sign of trouble, problems, what were they doing that God considered so sinful? Murmuring. Complaining. You know, of all the things, that you might consider, when you think of Israel's history, maybe the big sin we think of is idolatry, and rightly so. But often complaining is what led to idolatry. But we notice that the Lord's going to bring judgment, and there does seem to be this, when I say crisis of authority, this attitude toward the authority God had put in place in Moses. And Moses is struggling with this. And when we look at chapter 11, and let's just kind of refresh here just a tad. When you look at chapter 11, which we covered last week, the people start all this complaining. And what was it they were complaining about? What did you say, Mike? Tired of manna. Yeah, they're tired of manna. And we talked last week about the fact that manna could be used in various different ways. They would get up each morning and they will have had new manna. And you'll notice in chapter 11 and verse 1, now the Lord became like those who complain, or the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. So the judgment comes, as we mentioned last week, outside the camp, which itself is merciful, to be honest. But it still shows his judgment. And then he says, the people cried out to who? Moses. And Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. This is a theme you see in Numbers 2. God's judgment will be poured out, or God's wanting to pour judgment out on Israel. And Moses begs God to show mercy, even for his own name's sake, and he ends up not doing that. So when we come on down into verse 4, how he describes some foreigners who were among them, and they had greedy desires. It's called the rabble. Look at verse 4. They start asking for what? Meat. Okay. They're meat eaters. They want meat. Okay. Let's think about this for a minute. So God's been providing all these things, and they start talking about Egypt, and when they talk about Egypt, what do they say about Egypt? What's their memory look like of Egypt? It was paradise, man. It was wonderful. We had a great diet. It was, diverse, and we don't have any of that now. And if you were to go back and look and remember the history at all of them being slaves, how Egypt treated them, death, abuse of every kind. I mean, it's just amazing how when we start complaining that our memory of the past is so different than reality. And that might be something worth us thinking about is that when we start to think, and there's constructive critique, but then there's just complaining. When you start to think about things, is it really what happened? Is it reality? I mean, is that really what happened, or do I have a whole, I've got a whole different slant really to justify the complaint? It's really about just justifying the complaint and getting my way because I have greedy desires in the moment, right? So you have all of that going on in chapter 11, and they want something different. What's God going to do? Is he going to give them meat? Meat fest, yeah. How much? Just generally, how much? What'd you say, Roger? More than they ever want. Okay, so the meat, it's kind of interesting. We say, this is what we want, but what they end up getting, they get meat, all right, as you guys mentioned, but the meat itself, rather than being considered a blessing, becomes a judgment. And even as they're, before they can get all the meat together, they're eating the meat, what's going to happen? Well, God's going to pour judgment down on them. So the meat itself and what happens when they're eating the meat, just the amount of it, he says, okay, I'll give you meat. Why does God feel this way about, I mean, he could give them all the meat he wanted to. Why does he feel this way? Yes, they're not trusting him. And it's interesting how complaining is described throughout the context as you move through. It's described as evil, rebellion, and unbelief. We might not think of complaining that way, but this complaining was distrust, unbelief, rebellion, sinful, and even evil. And that's how he sees it. Because when you think about the covenant relationship that they had with God and all that he had done, and he had delivered them and blessed them with grace, and they'd enjoyed his blessings, and they're on the way to the promised land. And now this is how they respond. This is how they are acting. Okay, so when we come to this third scene kind of in chapter 11, moving on down, when you look at verses 10 through 15, what happens to Moses? All these people are coming to him, and they're complaining, and they're irrational and unreasonable and rebellious, and they have an evil heart. And of course, who are they going to be talking to about this? Moses. How does Moses feel about it? Overwhelmed. What does he ask God? I think he's pretty sincere in this. Yeah, take me out. There's a sermon title for you there, but just take me out. I mean, I can't do this anymore. Why does he want to be taken out? Just because these people are so unreasonable so he is literally the in-between. He is the go-between, and so he's catching it from all these people. Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Made their work hard.
Yeah.
So now they turn to God and complain that they made it hard to get meat. I mean, made it too hard on them.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, they're just
like
normal humans.
just like normal folks. Yeah, they complain all the time. Okay, so Moses says, take me out of this. And what happens? What does the Lord do? Does the Lord hear Moses? Yeah. That's another thing. When they were in affliction, this is the interesting thing. When Israel was in affliction, Exodus says God heard them, going all the way back to Moses. And he heard their affliction, and he delivered them. Here they are complaining. But Moses, this is interesting. Moses comes to God, and Moses is being very legitimate in what he's saying. I mean, he feels overwhelmed, and God cares for him. And so therefore, as a result of that, God says, I have a plan. So what's God going to do? Or what does he direct them to do? What'd you say?
Appoint assistants.
Yeah, he's going to appoint qualified men. You'll notice there. So he's going to delegate. So there's a time when you need to delegate. Part of the feeling overwhelmed is because he needed to do this. So if you'll look at verse 16, the Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting and let them take their stand there with you. And so there's a couple of things he does. First of all, these are men that have leadership qualities already. Secondly, this tent of meeting is always an important place. That's representative of God's presence. So there's God's approval, and there's a connection to Moses. All right, so these are not to be men that would undermine Moses in God's will, in God's purpose. Okay, so come on to verse. They consecrate them. You'll notice in verse 18, say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for you were well off in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat, not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. We might say until it's coming out your ears, but here you say you're just going to eat and eat and eat and eat, and you're going to realize what's happened and the rebellion against God. So you ask for this, but sometimes what you think you're asking for is really coming from rebellion to God. So now it's interesting what Moses says to God. God takes in a way that shows, okay, I'm concerned about Moses. Remember we talked about the difference between lamenting or even, really legitimate crying out to God versus those who are just complaining and have a bad attitude. It seems to me Moses crying out to God is much different than what Israel's is. His is coming out of frustration that even the Lord felt because he's having to deal with Israel. That was different. And so he says, the Lord's Spirit's going to empower, just the same Spirit that empowered Moses with special gifts is going to help these other men. They prophesied as confirmation. We read about that. But it's the same Spirit. Now, from what we can see, it didn't happen over and over, but it happened enough to confirm that God was with them. So when you come to chapter 11 and verses 26 through 29, look at Moses' nature as a faithful leader. Look at chapter 11 and verse 26 again. But 2 men remained in the camp, and the name of one was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them. Now they were among those who had been registered, but had not gone out to the tent. So they were supposed to come to the tent of meeting, but they hadn't gotten there, and they prophesied in the camp. So even those men were prophesying in the camp. Look at verse 28. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. In other words, they're not here. What does Moses say? What did you say?
He asked about their motive for wanting to make it stop.
Yeah. What did you say, Kel?
He wished that everyone had the Spirit.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting because it may foreshadow something that happens in the New Testament. So hang on to that thought in just a minute. So Moses is here, and they're like, they're not with us, so should you stop them? And Moses is saying, no. Moses is not this proud, tyrant, which is interesting because the people who struggled with jealousy and envy and self-seeking, and we're going to see this even more, even people close to Moses, tend to be the people that assume somebody else is thinking like they were. And Moses said, what are you doing? Which is what you were saying, Richard. No, I wish, whoever God wants to do this needs to do this. Okay, so when you think about it from that standpoint, what happened in the New Testament that maybe resonates with that? You remember? With Jesus and his disciples? Derek?
I was thinking about that Paul wrote about those who preach the gospel.
That's right.
even though their motive might have been wrong, he rejoiced that the gospel was preached.
Right,
I don't know if these people had a bad motive, but
right.
it's kind of a sinner.
Yeah, that's right. Can you think of another? That's a good one. Can you think of another one with Jesus and his disciples? Did his disciples ever say, but they're not with us?
Demons are performing signs.
Yeah.
And they thought that, well, they're not with us. Jesus talked about whoever's not with us is against us.
He was like, well, if they're actually doing the work of God, I'm not going to get in the way. It is kind of interesting because you have Jesus and his disciples. Here you have Moses and these servants. And Paul does make the point, look, I'll let God take care of the motives, but if they're doing the work of God, I'm not going to interfere with that. I'm not going to say, no, don't do that. Now, if they're not doing the work of God, okay, but God will take care of that. So when you come back to chapter 11, you see something about Moses, and the reason I want to emphasize that is that's going to become important in chapter 12 because there's going to be some more complaining going on. So the complaining is it's not like you have this one time. You're going to see how it spreads, and it even spreads to people that might surprise you. And that's how complaining is rooted in discontent on some level. And discontent can come, not always, but it can come from a selfish spirit. So the Spirit comes on some who do not go to the tent, and Moses says, I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets with God's Spirit. Well, I'm not gonna get in their way. Our desire needs to be for God's glory, not ours. And often when there's a problem with authority, that tends to be the case. So then you have verses 31 through 34. The Lord judges the people for the rejection of him, their blasphemy of his deliverance, which really is rather blasphemous. And let's read verses, Mike Binko, if you would, just read verses 31 through 35, or 34.
Quail from the sea and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side, about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. And the people stayed up all that day, all night, all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people. And the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So he called the name of that place Kilbroth Hatava, because there they buried the people who had yielded to craving.
You know what? We're going to give you extra points for getting that full place out. That's good. So look at this for a minute with me. So he has this wind drive these flocks of quail into the camp. They spread out. So they spread out as far as the eye could possibly see. And it says there's up to 2 cubits or 3 feet deep in places. And we talk about when we get a snow. You're talking about quail. At this point, I'm thinking, this is either really good or really bad. And I'm probably thinking if we've got 3 feet deep of quail, this may be bad. The people respond. They gather all that day and night and the next day. Now remember, they asked for all this. And they asked for it because they were rebellious. And you've got to think about this. When they asked for it, they're casting blame at God himself and talking about how great they had it in Egypt. You know, it's one thing to say, Lord, can we have this? It's something else to say, boy, it was great in Egypt, which undermines the whole story of his deliverance and his grace. Now look at this. So their gathering is estimated anywhere from 33 to 111 U.S. bushels. To the low end, that would be 33 bushels. That's 4,915 cups. And as I mentioned, that's a lot of quail soup. That's a lot. So this is one of those stories where you have the complaint, you have the judgment, all of that. Why does God feel this way? Look, they have to understand who he is, what they've received, And he's starting to see this spirit, this attitude of rebellion, and it's undermining. It's undermining his purpose. It's getting in the way of them getting to the promised land, which should tell us a lot about how complaining can work and what it can do. And we may think, well, is it that big of a deal? You know, here's complaining and here are these other sins. No, it depends on how intense it becomes. If it continues to be a problem, then it's actually, God sees it as unbelief and rebellion and an evil heart. So let's read Psalm 78. Let's turn to Psalm 78, verses 28 through 33. Psalm 78, 28 through 33. Garrett, could you get that for me? Yeah, and then let's look at, as Garrett is turning over there, we're going to then look at Psalm 106 and verse 15. Connor, can you get that for me? Yeah. It turn to Psalm 106, verse 15, if you would. Psalm 106, verse 15. Okay, Garrett, go ahead.
Then he let them fall in the midst of their camp, round about their dwellings. So they ate and were well filled, and their desire he gave to them. Before they had satisfied their desire, while their food was in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and killed some of their stoutest ones, and subdued the choice of the men of Israel. In spite of all this, they sinned and did not believe in his wonderful works. So he brought their days to an end in futility, and their years in sudden terror.
Okay, very good. Connor, go ahead.
So he gave him your request, but sent a wasting disease among them.
Very good. So he apparently, from those two texts, the psalmist is saying this was God's judgment. That's what this is. It's God's judgment. And the psalm that Connor read mentions this wasting disease of some sort. So you have severe disaster. So it's a severe disaster. It's not something quickly forgotten. God's really trying to make this point. When he puts judgment, it's also teaching. It's instruction. And then notice the place here is the graves of the craving. Their lust. And that's what 1 Corinthians 10 has mentioned to us. Their lust is what led to this. So if you have sinful complaining, what has led to this? Lust in the moment. I have this craving, this desire to such a point that I'm even willing to rewrite history. I'm willing to write out of history God's grace and mercy and deliverance and all that he's done for me. And we can do that. We can do that. And when you have some passages, turn to Philippians 2. Turn over to Philippians, the 2nd chapter. He's referencing, and this is referenced in the New Testament quite a lot. If you turn to Philippians 2, it's taking us back to the example of Israel and the problem in that example. So he says in verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. That's what Israel had not done. They had not remained within that faithful path for God, and there's going to be judgment for that. So complaining, as I mentioned to you, is the result of forgetting and denying God's goodness. You look at the Lord's past provisions of deliverance from Egypt in Exodus 1-15, defeating their enemies in the wilderness. We're going to read about that in number 17. Provided for water and food. And then, after all of that, Numbers 11, they say we're better off in Egypt. And just clearly not the case. But you see, that grumbling distorts your vision of what is right. And we have to be careful about that. So complaining and grumbling is called rebellion. It's described as selfishness, departure, distrust, evil, unbelief. So that's how God sees it. And it's the opposite. I'll get you, Alan, just a minute. it is the opposite of, what would be the opposite of complaining and grumbling and doing all that we're encouraged to do regularly? Be thankful. So thanks, really if you're thankful and appreciative to God, that's going to rule out murmuring and grumbling and complaining. So you might go, okay, if I'm struggling with that, how thankful have I been? Alan.
Manna every day, and it may have been very good, but I imagine they retired it, and it just didn't seem as, they wanted more variety in their meal or whatever. And I think there's application to us today is, God, it was purely from God, and He called upon them to eat it and to be thankful for it. But it wasn't what they were used to, or what they might want, right they want. And I think we can apply that to ourselves as well. Sometimes things are not as we would like them to be, and there may be reason at the very basic level, we're tired, whatever it is and that is. But we're not, we need to realize that it is a blessing from God, and we thankful for it, and not allow it to creep into and discontent all that. And, I think their lack of faithfulness, we might be able to appreciate if we were in their position, but we've got to apply it to ourselves.
Sure. Well, and it's not like it's not a cycle that, it happened with Israel, but it happens with God's people, generally speaking. And you can become dissatisfied with a lot of things that you shouldn't, like Alan said. I mean, it can be our personal lives, even as God's people, God's arrangements, God's organization. We can decide, we don't like this or we don't like that. So and Romans 1 mentions the Gentiles, generally, that's their first step off into that very, gross senses of immorality and all of that. But where did it begin? It began with a lack of thanksgiving, and then that led to the exaltation of human wisdom, and then there you go. And you just completely get into a place that you shouldn't. Daryl. Hang on, Don. Daryl.
And they should have learned from the manna was that even under that provision, if they gathered more than they needed, it spoiled. And here are these people, this is the least of them gathered these 50 barrels or whatever, bushels, way more than they needed. I think there's a lesson there in gluttony and I don't know what.
Yeah.
But they didn't learn that. They're out there scrambling around for hours, gathering up all they can. And it angered God.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Don?
I was going to say, I studied every Saturday night, in Timothy. Timothy talks about all the problems that you got, like bragging and idolatry and sexual immorality. But then at the last, at the end, they started talking good about God.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's interesting on that point. Many of these, when you go to the New Testament, many of these you'll have these lists. It's always interesting because you'll get these lists of these sins that you're talking about, and some of them we go, oh yeah, that needs to be on the list for sure, because I don't really struggle with that one, so that would definitely needs to be on the list, or it just seems like it ought to be on the list. But there's a couple of things that sometimes catch you by a little bit of a surprise. One is ingratitude, lack of thanksgiving. That's right there with it. And then also brotherly love is usually there. So on the same list where he's talking about idolatry or sexual immorality, he also talks about gratitude and thanksgiving. And so, yeah, that is all very important. So notice this with me. So this complaining, as we talked about, made Moses' burden very unbearable. They're discouraging the people around them. That can lead them into sin as well. So complaining actually can lead into rebellion that leads into more sin. We can read about that in 1 Corinthians 10. And as I mentioned to you, grumbling is associated with terrible sins, ranging from idolatry to sexual immorality. We've talked a lot about the difference in lamenting and complaining. The Lord lamented on the cross. Psalms 22 is a lament, and yes, is a messianic prophecy. So there is a difference between complaining and lamenting, etc. Let's move on here. I did want to share this quote. Anne Voskamp, writing about lamenting and crying out to God versus complaining, said, "Lament is a cry of belief in a good God, a God who has his ear to our hearts, a God who transfigures the ugly into beauty. Complaint is the bitter howl of unbelief in any benevolent God in this moment, a distrust in the love beat of the Father's heart." I thought that was a great quote because that's exactly what's going on with Israel. Israel's not doing this up here. It's not a cry of belief in a good God, is it? No, they're down here. They're questioning. It's unbelief in a benevolent God. So is it to make it about us? Is it to get our own way? Is it to hurt others? Is it to deflect? Is it to get people to have the same bad attitude that we have? Is that why we're saying this? Do we feel justified if we can get somebody else to complain like we do? And so you can see the difference in those things, and that's an important difference. Go ahead, Gary.
I'm not entirely sure what manna tastes like. I know it says it's that of coriander seed, and I'm not a big coriander or cilantro fan, so I might.
You might have been in the other group.
Yeah, I think it parallels nicely with the provisions that God provides for us today. Nowhere in Scripture do we see that, like, the physical things that He provides is going to bring us all this joy or gratification. You know, life here on earth is hard. But what the manna did for the Israelites is that it sustained them on their journey to the promised land. And we see that in our lives today. Like, things are hard. There's sickness and illness. There's things that are difficult to live through, but God provides us with the thing to sustain us and allow us to find our joy in heaven.
I think that's a really good point because when you look, even when the Lord is teaching his disciples to pray, when he says to pray, "Give us this day our daily food," that is in a spiritual context. In other words, sometimes when we think about physical, it's like, give me the physical so I'll be satisfied, rather than I need this nourishment so I can serve God. We need just whatever God wants to give us, we need that nourishment so we can move to the promised land because things are going to be wonderful there. And so I think that's a really valid point. How do we look at our physical blessings? Is it just I'm happy I have them? Or is it they come from God and they're a means to an end? So the end is not the physical. The physical is a means to an end, including our physical life. Okay, chapter 12. I want to try to at least get this out there. Chapter 12. Then Miriam, so this complaining just keeps going. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman, and they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. Now, we'll talk more next week. The Lord's going to ask them to come to the tent of meeting. It's like getting called to the office, okay? You're going to go to the tent of the meeting, and there's going to be some severe judgment for Miriam. Miriam seems, even though Aaron's involved, the original language is in feminine form. She's leading the charge on this. Who is Miriam to Moses? Sister. Can you imagine a sister picking on her brother? But that's exactly what's happening. So when you look at this, there's a couple of things I want you to think about. Tell me what's going on here with Miriam. The Bible mentions a couple of things. What's pushing this complaining? Jealousy. Now, was Miriam a prophetess? Yeah. Was Aaron important? Yeah. Was there a difference in Moses and Miriam and Aaron? Yes. The Lord had a whole different kind of relationship with Moses. He's going to go on to say that. In fact, look at verse 6. He says, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household, with whom I speak, mouth to mouth, even openly, not in dark sayings. and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? So Moses has a special place. Now, before you move, don't move. There's something else that text mentions that we want to talk a little bit about next Sunday. What does the text say? It's not the only thing, but it's one of the things. What did they resent? He married a Cushite. It was not against Israelite law for him to have married her. So what's an undercurrent? There's some racism going on here. They're further away from us than the Midianites are. Okay? And there's some racism towards those of darker skin and that kind of thing. And we'll talk about that. So a lot's coming out here in chapter 12. All right.